Hello and welcome to another episode of PodcastDX, the show that brings you interviews with people just like you, whose lives were forever changed by a medical diagnosis. I'm Lita.
I'm Ron.
And I'm Jean Marie.
Collectively, we're the hosts of PodcastDX. On today's show, we are speaking with Meredith. Meredith is a patient advocate who is living with Myasthenia Gravis herself.
Coping with this disease for more than 15 years, Meredith uses her experience to educate, engage, and empower others regarding all things chronic illness. Hi, Meredith.
Welcome to the show, Meredith.
Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for having me on today.
Perfect.
Thank you for joining us. Could you start off by telling us what actually is myasthenia gravis? It's an autoimmune disease, isn't it?
Correct, Ron. Yes, that's correct. Myasthenia gravis is a rare chronic neuromuscular autoimmune disease that is characterized by weakness and fatigue of the skeletal muscles or muscles under voluntary control throughout the body. So in a healthy body, the brain communicates to the muscles through electrical signals that travel to the motor nerves, in which the nerve endings release a neurotransmitter known as acetylcholine.
Okay. Once
released, the acetylcholine binds to their specific receptors, allowing the muscles to contract appropriately. However, in someone who has generalized myasthenia, the body mistakenly interprets this normal transmission as dangerous.
Oh.
And as a result, the body reacts by sending antibodies, which are the body's natural immune defenses, to attack and destroy the acetylcholine receptors, preventing the muscles from contracting.
Wow.
So the hallmark of myasthenia is muscle weakness that worsens after periods of activity and improves after periods of rest. The symptoms of MG can vary in terms of severity, type, and onset, but many people who have MG will experience fatigue and weakness at some point, whether that's in their eyes, face, jaw and throat, their speech, their limbs and neck, and their respiratory muscles. Mm-hmm. In my particular case, I experienced what one neurologist stated as textbook myasthenia.
Oh.
I had trouble chewing, swallowing, smiling, seeing, speaking. I had droopy eyelids and weakness throughout both my neck and limbs.
Okay. All right. When did your symptoms first start?
So as far as I can remember, my symptoms started to develop right around the age of 11 years old. The first symptom to really show up was the droopiness of my eyelids. Mm-hmm. I have really big brown eyes, and my eyelids drooped so much that I could barely see out of the slits of them. They often felt tired and heavy, and I struggled to keep them open. But in myasthenia, this is often the first symptom to appear and usually the last to heal.
Okay. And Meredith, was it like a sudden onset, or did something happen to, when you were 11, did something happen to you and then all of a sudden the symptoms started?
Right. So my myasthenia progressed relatively slowly, proving it difficult for doctors to land an accurate diagnosis. My symptoms were also intermittent, so at times I would feel, perfectly fine and look fine, but then for the most parts of my days I felt very lethargic and weak. But nevertheless, there were certain incidences that unfortunately made me pause and question what was going on, what I was going through, but not necessarily the people around me. So, for example, when I was in 6th grade, I was presenting a project that consisted of various types of poems that we were required to create. Mm-hmm. And as I read these aloud, my voice became weaker and weaker, and I sounded extremely nasally as I struggled with pronunciation and articulating my words. It almost sounded as if I was having a stroke.
Wow.
I apologized to the class, stating I had a cold, even though I didn't, as I was completely mortified by what was happening, and I needed some sort of excuse for it. Another time, gym class was always a scary time during my middle school years. So every year we were required to do, that dreaded mile run, and I can remember being so weak that I felt my legs were going to give out. And a friend of mine had patted me on the back and sped past me stating, come on, O'Connor, to then in which I fell down as my legs completely buckled.
Wow.
To others, it was just it looked like a tryst, but deep down, I knew this was not normal. So what I ended up doing was I used this incident as an excuse and actually fabricated a knee injury in order to save myself from any other situations like the ones I had experienced. And I would go home and actually strike my knee and draw on it with like bruised-like colors. And I went as far as getting a doctor's note to sign me out of PE class. At this point, I was in survival mode. I had to survive, and I was doing whatever it took to do so.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, thank you.
Earlier, you mentioned diagnosis. We've interviewed a lot of other people with autoimmune diseases, and it does take a long time for people to get diagnosed. With MG, how long did it take to get a diagnosis? In your case, anyways.
Right. Yeah. So, well, for me, it took. I was misdiagnosed for 2 years. That's pretty typical. I feel like with many autoimmune diseases, because they share the same symptoms, it becomes difficult to pinpoint one specific disease. So, yeah, it took about 2 years.
You were saying that for you it took
2 years.
2 years, but how long is that typical for a patient?
I think it really varies from patient to patient depending on the severity of their case and where the fatigue and weakness lies within their muscles. So for me, I have generalized myasthenia, meaning I have it throughout my whole body. So for me, 2 years was a very long time. It was a terrible 2 years.
I'm sure.
Especially
at the point,
at that age.
like where I was. Oh, exactly. And it was a time of transition, a time where, puberty was just hitting and, people are already so judgmental. So it was a very difficult time.
Mm-hmm.
We spoke with someone else regarding some medical issues, and I would have the same question with you. I would imagine that general practitioners would not even really suspect anything like that right away and wouldn't necessarily even know where to send you, especially at age 11 with growing and all that this would probably be one of the last things that they would think of.
Exactly. And that's exactly what happened. When I went in, I explained my my issues and all the symptoms I had. Many thought there's so many things that could have been applied to because of my, fatigue and weakness. That could be anything.
Mm-hmm.
And with myasthenia gravis, it's actually, it's not typical to be diagnosed when you're a young child. So that made it even more problematic to get an accurate diagnosis. So, my symptoms, again, they can be very, you can apply them to all these different autoimmune disorders, but even still, like with being that age, it could have been anything. So,
Right.
Yes, it was very difficult to diagnose.
And what kind of testing do they do in order to diagnose this?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different tests to confirm a diagnosis, and one is a neurological exam, and that's where physicians, they take a medical history and then do an actual physical examination, and usually they're looking for things such as they're pertaining to your reflexes, your muscle strength and tone, your senses. Sorry, I'll start that over.
Sure.
So there's a neurological examination where physicians, they take down a medical history and do a physical exam, and they're usually looking for things pertaining to your reflexes, muscle strength and tone, coordination and balance, speech and vision. There's also a test called an hydrophonium test, which is an injection of hydrophonium chloride that can briefly relieve the weakness in people with MG. Recently, though, I did find out that there might be a discontinuation of hydrophonium chloride, so I'm unsure if this diagnostic test is still used. There's also blood tests that can be conducted to check for certain antibodies associated with myasthenia. The first type is anti-acetylcholine receptor positive antibody. The second type is anti-muscle specific kinase positive antibody, better known as anti-MuSK. The third is anti-low density lipoprotein receptor related protein 4 positive antibody. It's a mouthful.
I'm glad you said that.
Yeah.
Wow. My word.
It's like, what are you testing for? And in some cases, people who have MG, no antibody is detected, and they're known as having seronegative myasthenia.
Okay.
There's also other various things such as, an EMG that can be done. You can get a CT scan or MRI to check out your thymus gland to see if it's enlarged, or to see if you have a thymoma, which is a tumor of the thymus gland. And the thymus gland it's associated with myasthenia, but its function is not fully understood.
Okay.
So because, like I said, weakness is such a common symptom in so many disorders, it can be so difficult to diagnose, and practitioners often miss this disease.
Well, I'm kind of curious when you say that they do a physical exam and they test muscle strength and things. When you're saying that the muscle weakness comes after exertion, not necessarily right in the beginning. If you're just walking into a doctor's office and you're sitting there and they say, squeeze my hands, push against my hands.
Exactly.
Well, you're strong at that point. They need to really tax you a little bit before they test you.
I completely agree. It's so funny. When I go into these neurological exams, and I still take my medicine even before the exam. So I'm like, is that even an accurate measure of what my strength is?
Right.
I'm being medicated.
Right.
So I've always felt, I don't know how much of an accurate measure it is, but that's their protocol.
Okay. They don't ask you to run a mile before.
Right.
I mean, that would, yeah.
What did you say? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I just said they don't ask you to go out and run around the block or anything like that.
No.
Okay.
And you would think with myasthenia particularly that that would be the case, but no.
Right.
Kind of like doing a test of your cardiac health where you have to be on a treadmill for a while. And
right. They do some pulmonary testing.
Okay.
There is pulmonary testing that can be done before they check your breathing strength. But typically, at least for me, I was diagnosed through a blood test and neurological exam. And because I had one of the specific antibodies. So I feel like that's pretty common. The other ones aren't as common, but it's just a neurological exam, which I agree with you. I don't know if it's an accurate measure.
Well, maybe we should have some doctors listen to this podcast and take our advice.
Well,
Agreed.
With the blood test, is that something that could be added? Because when kids are in school, they have to get, every so many years, they've got to get, a physician's approval to go back to school. Is that something that could be a standard part of a blood test?
Well, you would think. I don't know what goes all in standardized blood tests, and I don't know how many different antibodies they're checking for. And because the disease is so rare,
maybe unless there's a problem, they probably don't.
Okay.
Right. Maybe it's like a financial thing. I'm not even sure what might be the reasoning behind it, but nevertheless, I think the main reason is because it's so rare. Like, why would you check it?
Right.
Well, I have seen that technology is starting to play a role more and more in the healthcare environment, and now there are like flow charts available for physicians. So, like, if these symptoms are present, you might want to run this test. If this test is positive, then you do this. If this test is negative, then try this, just to try to prevent misdiagnosis and achieve a diagnosis a little bit quicker, hopefully.
Right, exactly.
Well, Meredith, I have never heard of myasthenia gravis until you signed up for the interview. But we started researching a little bit. Could you please tell us the progression of the disease? Is this something that will get progressively better or worse with time?
Yeah, so not a surprise you haven't heard of it. It is rare, and a lot of people, whenever I tell people I have myasthenia, they're like, well, yeah, I think I've heard of it. I'm like, no, you haven't.
and you know what? Just as an aside, you won't believe this. And we have not posted that we're going to be doing this interview or anything, but we got another interview coming up next week for the same thing.
Well, it's actually...
I just saw that. I've seen the woman. She's been in different various support groups, and I saw that. So it's so funny.
It is.
And
it's like, wow. Yes, right. It's like, wow, how on earth could we get two in one and we've never heard of it?
I know. I know, small world.
Definitely. So tell me about this progression.
Sure. So currently there's no cure for myasthenia. However, once you're diagnosed, there are ways to manage the disease effectively through various treatment plans. If untreated, though, this can leave someone so weak that it could cause respiratory failure and they could go into a myasthenic crisis. However, on the opposite end of the spectrum, people can go into remission, meaning they either temporarily or permanently have no symptoms and don't require medication. So it really just varies from person to person.
Wow.
It's great to know that remission is a possibility.
Agreed.
That's wonderful. Meredith, we know that everyone is unique and that a disease or illness will affect everyone differently, requiring a treatment tailored to that individual. So in broad strokes, could you tell us, how are you being currently treated and what treatments have you received? You said you were taking medication, and then can you exercise or do physical activity? Because you said that affects your signs and symptoms. And, how do you keep your muscles strong? And then do you, I hate to throw another question, but do you plan on rest breaks like throughout your day, and does that help?
Right, yeah. So all good questions. In my particular case, my neurologist put me on a medication called Mestinon, which is a anticholinesterase medication that is used to slow that breakdown of acetylcholine at the neuromuscular juncture. And I take this medication about every 4 hours to improve that. Yeah, and it's a lot. Yeah, every 3 to 4 hours to improve that neuromuscular transmission and increase my muscle strength. The Mestinon kind of acts as a Band-Aid for the symptoms, if you will.
Okay.
And then I also take prednisone, and I'm on a very specific steroid therapy, which has always been a shock to other people who are on MG. It's kind of a different way of using steroids. So, but the whole point is to minimize some of those common side effects that you see with prednisone, such as weight gain. So for 2 days out of the week, I take a small dose of steroids. In my early years with myasthenia, I started on a very low dose, and then I slowly built up to a very high dose. And then once I hit my peak strength, we began tapering down that dosage.
Okay.
I have surprisingly responded very well to the steroids. However, a lot of people prefer not to use steroids, and such a prolonged use of steroids can actually be detrimental to one's health. So currently I'm actually looking into other treatment options right now because I've been on steroids for such a long time.
Okay.
In the past, I was hospitalized and I underwent different treatments, including plasmapheresis, IVIG, and I also had a thymectomy. And plasmapheresis is where they use a machine to remove those abnormal antibodies in your plasma and replenish them with healthy plasma. And then IVIG is an intravenous immunoglobulin, which is a high concentration of antibodies collected from healthy donors and given to those with MG. And then, like I said, my thymus was, I had a thymectomy, which is where they removed the thymus. And I had it done through a procedure called minimally invasive transcervical thymectomy. So rather doing like open heart surgery, I just have a small 1-inch incision right at the bottom of my neck.
Oh, okay.
So, which is really great considering I was 14 at the time. And my doctor really took into consideration my lifestyle and not just seeing me as a patient. She knew that having such a huge scar, down my chest would be really, really difficult, I think, for me emotionally. So being able to do the transcervical thymectomy was huge.
For sure. I know when I had my my neck fused, I asked the doctor to put a plug in the side of my neck so that I could dress up like Frankenstein for Halloween.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. It's things like that, though, that you wouldn't think about, but it's truly important, and it's something to consider when looking at a patient and treating them. Looking at the whole person and not just the patient.
Right. Absolutely. Right. And what is a crisis? You said that there's something called a crisis?
Yeah, so a myasthenic crisis, well, according to the NIH, a myasthenic crisis is a life-threatening medical emergency that occurs when the muscles that control breathing weakened to the point where individuals require a ventilator to help them breathe. So usually this requires immediate medical attention, and this can be caused by a lot of things, whether it's infection or stress, surgery, an adverse reaction to medication. There's so many ways you can go into a myasthenic crisis. So it's a very scary thing that can occur for people who have MG.
And what do they do then?
Thankfully, I've actually never had a myasthenic crisis. So, I know many people have, and I know it's a very scary thing to endure. So I myself can't speak to what they actually do.
I mean, do you think they actually do get put on a ventilator then?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
And I've seen so many people be put on vents, and it's very scary. It is.
Well, sure.
It is a real. And I think about that. Right now, like I said, I told you I'm looking into other treatment options, and I think part of the reason I've stayed on steroids for so long is because I've been able to tolerate it. And I'm scared that if I were to change my regimen, that I could go into a crisis. So it's things like that it's just, it creates gravity to the situation. There's a lot of gravity to the situation,
mm-hmm.
and I feel,
mm-hmm.
That's part of the hesitation for me. But I know if a myasthenic crisis were to happen, I thankfully am very fortunate to have a support system that understands the gravity of the situation, and I trust that they would know what to do if something like this were to occur. So, like I said, I'm very grateful for that, but I try to not put those thoughts into my head, but it can happen in just a snap. I mean,
mm-hmm.
it's a very scary thing that can happen in myasthenia.
I apologize because you may have already answered this, but does this typically start early on in life, or is there...
No. So that was, again, one of the issues why it took so long for me to get diagnosed, was because it typically is diagnosed. Back in the day I was diagnosed, it usually said it was diagnosed in like older men.
Oh.
Now I think they've kind of come down a little bit and said, it can happen to women in like their 30s and 40s, and men in their 50s. So yes, I mean, this is not typical. My case is not typical, at least, and no one's is. I mean, myasthenia is considered a snowflake disease, meaning everyone's case is so different.
Sure.
And
I mean, it almost sounds a little similar to muscular dystrophy. Again, when you're at such a young age and you have muscle weakness like that,
right?
That would be one of the things.
Yeah, no, it's very similar to muscular dystrophy, and it's actually myasthenia is housed under the MDA hub, if you will. It's one of the neuromuscular diseases that MDA supports. Or MDA supports one of the neuromuscular diseases. So, yes, very similar to muscular dystrophy.
Okay. I understand that you are a wonderful writer, besides being a patient advocate. Can you explain what you do to help others with this disease?
Sure. Well, thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. Ever since I was diagnosed with this disease, I knew I had two options, which was either to let this disease define me or let me define it. And I chose the latter. Right after I was hospitalized, I actually created a nonprofit organization which provided gifts and necessities patients and families could enjoy during a hospital stay. This was such a passion project for me because I was treated at St. Louis Children's Hospital, and even though I was undergoing such critical treatments and very serious stuff, like the people there and the environment there, they made it very magical and actually I felt safe,
mm-hmm.
and so I wanted to give back in any way that I could. So this passion project, alongside my experience with myasthenia, really inspired me to pursue a career in helping others with chronic illness and disability. So I went on actually to pursue my bachelor's degree in psychology and minor in healthcare ethics, and then later earned my master's degree in social work with a concentration in health.
Okay.
Good for you.
Yeah, thank you. It was difficult, but one achievement that I'm truly proud of. But throughout my academic years, I spent time blogging about, this lived experience with myasthenia. I would participate in speaking engagements related to anything in healthcare, which was so ironic because I was so scared for so long to get back up in front of a crowd after that. I had a lot of post-traumatic stress.
Sure.
After that experience, reading my project to the class and really struggling to get through. So now considering myself a public speaker, it's come full circle,
okay.
Which is very, very neat.
Very empowering.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It's taken a lot of courage on my part and a lot of strength that I didn't know I had. And so it's, very empowering. So presently, I'm currently in the process of creating my own patient advocacy business. So ultimately, my goal is to utilize my personal and professional expertise to educate, engage, and empower others with the intent to inspire greater awareness, productive dialogue, and welcome diversity within the healthcare domain, just like we're doing now, stuff like this.
It's wonderful.
Well, that's wonderful. Meredith, what does the future of care for patients with MG look like? Do you know if there's any research going on right now leading to a cure?
Sure. There's no cure for MG, but like I said, there are ways to manage the disease. There's different treatment modalities, oral medication, which I'm on. There's infusions, surgery, and just maintaining an overall healthy, balanced life. The latest research has revealed a new treatment option, actually, known as Solaris. And Solaris is the first and only complement inhibitor for patients with MG, and that's an infusion treatment. So overall, though, there is research being conducted to improve a more targeted approach to diagnosis and treatment for MG.
Okay. And Meredith, can you tell us, what helps you make it, or what makes your days more comfortable or a little bit easier? Do you have any tips, hints, or other helpful advice for others that but others with MG?
Well, having MG for 15 some odd years now, I've figured out ways that have helped me cope with this disease. And I think one of the things I really, covet is having a routine is key. Getting a full 9 hours of sleep, going to bed and waking up at the same time each day, taking my medicine diligently, and resting constantly. MG fluctuates, so you have to learn patience, you have to be flexible, and you have to be adaptable to any situation you encounter. And that, the biggest piece of advice I can give to those who have MG or anyone with chronic illness for that matter is to self-advocate.
Mm-hmm.
For so long, I was dismissed, I was overlooked, and I fell through the cracks. And additionally, having a rare disorder, and then particularly one that is mostly invisible now, it's hard for people to comprehend. So my advice is to advocate for yourself, your needs, and your health, and because you know your body best, and your worth is not determined by your illness. Always remember that.
Certainly. What about your friends and family? How have they helped you along with your journey?
My support system has played such an integral role in the healing process of my MG. I would most definitely not be where I am today if it wasn't for my friends and family. Chronic illness can be hard to understand for some people, and I'm so genuinely grateful for those in my life that have stood by me every step of the way, even in the hardest of times. I'm forever indebted to the individuals that have helped me, and I can continue to help me. And I thank God every day to be so fortunate to have such wonderful people by my side.
That's great. That's great. And how can our listeners learn more about you and MG? You say that you blog?
Correct. Well, in terms of learning more about myasthenia gravis, the disease itself, I suggest visiting, various websites such as the National Myasthenia Gravis Foundation of America, or you can even go to, the MDA website, Muscular Dystrophy Association. They support people with muscle debilitating diseases. Also, if you're in the Midwest area, particularly Missouri, Kansas, and Northwest Arkansas, the Myasthenia Gravis Association is a wonderful resource specifically supporting MG patients in these communities. And like I said before, I'm in the process of building my advocacy business, and I'm in the process of building my website, so stay tuned.
Okay.
And then as soon as it's completed, I will let you know, because I really would love for listeners to be able to
definitely
to access that. But for now, you can visit. I have an advocacy profile on Instagram, and then I also have a link tree highlighting all my advocacy work thus far, including articles I've written, interviews, and organizations I'm involved with.
Okay, great.
Meredith, we can't thank you enough for joining our show today. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Yes, thank you, Meredith.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to tell my story. I appreciate it so much.
It's our honor.
Mm-hmm.
If you have any questions or comments related to today's show, you can contact us at PodcastDX@yahoo.com, through our website, PodcastDX.com, on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, or Instagram.
And if you have a moment to spare, please give us a review wherever you get your podcast. As always, please keep in mind that this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or treatment, and before undertaking a new healthcare regime. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you've heard on this podcast.
Till next week.